In today's video, I'll be painting the Skaven Grey Seer from the Skaventide box set using only green colors.
Okay, maybe not just green, but I will find a way to use some green for almost every element on the model by using colors containing green, or where that is not possible, by adding a green OSL glow from below. And why do I want to do this? Because this will help me place him in an environment illuminated by the eerie glow of warpstone, but also to have a nice unified color scheme. The idea is to use only colors containing some green or something from the red spectrum like purple and magenta, but with a green OSL in the shadows, which should make for a cohesive look, or at least that is the theory.
But before we jump into the painting, I have a quick announcement to make, and no, this is not a sponsor segment.
With this project, I'm launching a new initiative on the channel. A 10-15 minute video is a great way to give you a quick summary of what I did on the model, but from the comments I know that there are those of you who would like to know more. Like the list of all the paints used and all the steps of the process written down so that you can follow it step by step and use some of it on your own models. So while working on this video, I also created a written guide broken down into 3 documents which go through every step of the painting process of this model with a ton of pictures and explanations for every stage. Plus, in addition to the one for the current video, I also created more guides retroactively for a few of my previous projects as well in the same style with more to come. And I also have some much longer videos in the works for these as well, with a ton more footage than the original content I published on the channel and more detailed commentary to go with it. And of course I will be creating these for future content as well, so there is a lot more to come. The written guides as well as the long form videos to go with them will be accessible through the channel membership here on YouTube and also on my new Patreon if you prefer that. You can find the link in the video description if you want to grab those PDFs and want to support the channel.
For now, this is only a soft launch of the membership content both on YouTube and Patreon, with a lot more content and a proper announcement coming soon. In the meantime, let me know what you would like to see added on top of the PDFs and the longer format videos, and I hope I can welcome some of you as my Patreons and channel members.
Alright, let's get back to painting. Before I grab the brush, I gave the model a quick Zenithal highlight, but this time not with my usual white, but with a dark red color. This will barely be visible later on as I will cover it with other colors, but it will do 2 things for me. It allows me to see where the volumes are, which can be a bit difficult on a black prime model, but without the problems that a white primer creates. It also adds a very subtle warm red undertone onto the model, which will go really well with all the greens I am planning to use and also some of the other colors like purple. Once I was done with this, it was time to introduce green right from the start as well. I took some emerald green and sprayed it from below into the shadows of the model. This is essentially a reverse zenithal highlight and it will serve me as the basis of the green OSL. And by the way, you can do both the red and the green zenithal and Nadiral, I guess, with a spray can as well.
With that, I put the airbrush aside and grabbed the brush for the rest of the model, and as usual, I started with the bigger surface of the model, in this specific case, the purple cloak.
And why the color purple? Mostly because it's on the opposite side of the color wheel from the green, which means that the green OSL will look great on it. Plus, it will work wonderfully together with the red underpainting we did before. That's one of the nice things about picking a unifying color like green. Once you know that's gonna be your dominating color, it narrows down your selection of colors on the model and makes your choices so much easier. The trick here is to understand that the cloak will be actually painted in 2 colors. Purple on every surface facing up and green on all the surfaces facing down. So I only need to highlight everything facing up now and I will come back and paint all the green stuff later. As usual, I started by edge highlighting everything, and then with scratchy brush strokes I started creating textures on the surfaces of the cloak. Where there was more space, I overlapped the scratches to make highlights, and where there was a lot of space or the fold was completely facing the light coming from above, I made them a solid purple. Then I repeated the process with a lighter violet color, but now on a smaller surface inside the previous highlight. Finally, I added ice yellow to the violet to brighten it up and used this mix to continue highlighting. You will see this as a recurring theme for all the colors. I will be mixing in ice yellow for the later highlights when I want to make the colors brighter, but also somewhat warmer. If I want the highlights to be super warm and colorful, I will use laser yellow instead. And I will do the same thing with ivory when I want them to be slightly colder, like on the metals. There will be a lot of green on this cloak from the green OSL, but I still wanted to sneak some more in and make the highlights pop a little bit more at the same time, so I glazed in some laser yellow into the midtones next to the highlights. Alright, with that with the purple, so now it's time for the main attraction, the green OSL. I will be painting not only the cloak, but all the green OSL everywhere at this stage, and I will make some changes later on, but it should be more or less final after this. I repeated the process I did with the purple, but this time in reverse. Instead of edge highlighting the upward facing edges, I highlighted all the edges facing down, except some that I thought the light wouldn't hit from the bottom because something is in the way. I use the same color that I originally used through the airbrush, but because the airbrush desaturates everything, it will be more vibrant when I use it with the brush, so it works as a highlight. The guiding principle here is that in OSL, the source of the light is always the brightest, and the farther something is from the source, the less light it gets. So things closer to the top of the model shouldn't even be highlighted. But every edge and surface facing down, starting around the middle of the model, gets highlighted with this color, and as I go up in brightness, I will only do the highlights closer and closer to the source of the light, which is basically the green stuff swirling around the bell on the ground level. Metals behave slightly differently though. They reflect more light than the other materials, so they are shinier, or at least their edges usually are. This means that they should have more green on them even when they are higher up on the model. A good example of this is the blade of the Dagger, where I over-dramatize this a bit to create a nice green reflection on the bottom of the blade. Laser yellow is my friend here, as I push the highlights further and further, getting closer to the light source. I'm mixing it into the emerald more and more until my final highlights are pure laser yellow.
With the cloak done, I was contemplating what color I should paint the scarf around his neck. And for a while I thought it should be simply part of the purple cloak, but that would be a bit boring, so I had to come up with something else.
And when in doubt, paint green, right? So this part of the cloak will not have OSL since it's high up, but it will be a nice warm yellowish green to contrast with the purple and to differentiate it from the other greens that I will still be painting around it. The painting process is the same as the rest of the cloak, but this time there is no green OSL, so I only need to paint one color and keep the original red in the shadows, which suits me just fine. By the way, I used laser yellow to brighten up the olive color for the highlights, and for the final highlights I added a little ice yellow to the mix.
With the cloak done, let's get some of the other things that can be green out of the way. Let's paint some skin with green OSL.
Obviously the skin needed to have some green on it, which is okay since at least on the tail and the feet it will be hit by the green OSL light. But it also had to be in the reddish spectrum to be on the opposite end from the green on the color wheel. And of course it had to be different from the cloak, so to contrast both with the greens and the cold color on the cloak, I used a nice warm magenta as my base color. On the tail I started by painting the entire top part of the segments with this and then created smaller and smaller round highlights in the middle by mixing in ice yellow again. I used the original dark red color mixed with a little black to reinforce the separation between the sections on the tail and between the skin and the other materials. And when I went a bit too far with the highlight and lost color, I glazed back some of the original magenta, pulling the glaze down and away from the brightest highlights. The face and the hands and feet received the same treatment, but on the face I only painted the nose and the forehead this color, and then later realized that some of what I thought should be fur is probably also just skin, so at some point I repainted those parts.
At this point I was done with some of the biggest, most visible elements on the model, except the metals. So before I tackle those, let's paint some of the other things like the fur, the bones and the wood. And of course, if in doubt, paint green, so I will be using colors containing green for all of those.
For the little patchy fur he has going, I needed something grey since he's a Grey Seer after all, but to sneak in the green I used German Field Grey, which is a very greenish grey. And of course I used ice yellow to brighten it up for the highlights. For the horns on his head plus the fangs and the claws I did a similar trick and went with green-brown, which is a brown but once again has a lot of green in it. I painted all the raised elements of the horns with this color, and in the segments inside those I made some scratchy highlights, but I concentrated them mostly around the base of the horns, which I wanted to be brighter while leaving the tip completely dark. When I was done with the first pass of highlights, I used the original dark red color and glazed it back from the middle towards the tip of the horn. This left some of the edge highlights and some scratches that I did still visible, but it integrated them and made the tip darker. Then I mixed some ivory into the green-brown and used this lighter mix to once again edge highlight and create texture, but this time only from the middle of the horn and down. To create a nice transition between the dark and light parts, I thinned down some of the original green-brown and glazed it into the middle. Then I added more ivory into the mix and continued highlighting towards the base of the horn until I finished with pure ivory on a very small surface at the base. The wood I highlighted with yet another greenish color, burnt umber. I highlighted all the edges on the wooden beam and on the weapon shaft. Then I kept adding ivory and used that mix to paint smaller and smaller highlights, concentrating more and more on the upper part of the beam and the shaft. Finally, I glazed some wildwood contrast paint from the top towards the bottom to bring back the color and make the wood look more interesting.
Now, with most of the other elements finished, it was time to turn to the most fun part of the model, the metals, and not the usual golds, but something that resembles bronze and copper.
For the metals, I decided to go with mostly red colors and use the OSL and some verdigris effects to add the greenish tint. This gave me a good opportunity to try out something that is different from my usual yellow-based non-metallic metals and do some red metals instead, like copper and bronze. But first, since you probably already noticed that I like to start with the most prominent elements, let's do the Dagger and his segmented armor. The main color I chose for this is reddish grey from AK Interactive. I will aim for a reddish rusted iron look with this one, with the green OSL providing the green tint I need. First of all, I edge highlighted everything, which is the basis for any non-metallic metal. On the dagger, I separated the cutting edge and the rest of the blade with an edge highlight because I wanted to paint two different styles on the two parts to make it look more interesting. I also painted two more bright spots on the cutting edge next to the green highlight at the bottom I had done before. But the top part of the blade, which is not the cutting edge, received only scratches and no big highlights. The armor I also separated into two sides. The panels facing up I highlighted with the reddish grey, those are on the right or his left, but the ones facing down I highlighted in the same green colors as before, following the same process as with the grey. Then I started adding ivory into the mix and pushing the highlights brighter until I reached pure ivory on some select edges and the very middle of the big highlights. You might have noticed that so far I have not used any white on this model, and even pure ivory in only some rare cases like the brightest spots on the horns. That is because the metals need to be the brightest elements on the Mini and they need the biggest contrast between light and shadows, so I reserved the brightest color for them. But even on the metals I used it very sparingly, only in small dots on the rivets and on the corners, plus a couple of dots here and there. When I was done with the highlights I used some rust colors from AK to stipple and scratch in some texture on the darker side of the dagger. And use the same colors thinned down slightly to create some rust effects around the rivets of the armor as well, by first creating a bigger puddle under the rivet and then painting the lighter color inside the darker one. Finally, I picked out the runes on the dagger with the same green colors I used for the OSL as well to make them look like they are glowing.
Next, it was time to paint the bell the Grey Seer is standing on.
Here my main color is a super saturated reddish brown color, Mournfang Brown from Citadel. I will desaturate it quite a bit with the highlighting, but then in the end we can bring back some of it with a little glazing. First of all, I painted all the upward facing edges of the bell with this. I also painted big volumetric highlights on the larger surfaces with the usual scratchy technique following the curve of the bell. These are similar to the green ones I had already done before, but only on the surfaces that are facing away from the source of the OSL. I used the band around the bell as a separation line on the frontal view, imagining that it and the backward tilt of the bell together prevent the green light from hitting the surfaces above the band. On the backside this effect is broken because the bell is tilting towards the ground there. I used the ivory to desaturate and brighten up the brown and use this mix to repeat what I did before, but now only inside the Mournfang Brown highlight. I did a lot of scratches on the borders overlapping in the middle, reinforced by some solid color in the very center. Then a thin glaze of the same mix to integrate the scratches and create a smooth transition between this mix and the Mournfang Brown. Finally, I glazed in the midtones with a glaze of the original Mournfang Brown to bring back the color and saturation a little. I switched to pure ivory for the final highlights only on super small surfaces and prominent edges plus the rivets. And finally I used some tiny amounts of pure white in dots and little scratches here and there. With all that done, I used the glaze of dark sea blue to glaze in between the shadows and the midtones on the bell. This helped me make it a bit darker, added another interesting tone that is also associated with bronze, smoothed out the transitions a little, and of course I snuck in some tiny amount of green tone with this as well. And since I was already at it, I dropped a bit under the rivets to make it look like verdigris and added a little lighter turquoise color as well to reinforce the effect.
Now the only thing left to do was the symbol of the horned rat on top of his staff. This will be quite similar to the bronze right up until the end, but we will pull a magic trick and turn it into copper somehow.
The color of choice here will be saddle brown from AK Interactive. First I painted every single edge on the symbol, then I created a highlight on every individual element as well. Instead of brightening the highlights up with ice yellow or ivory, I went with specific colors instead for some reason, so for the second highlight I switched to beige red. With this color I repeated the previous exercise, but this time only painting the upward facing edges of the sign and painting smaller highlights inside the first ones. Then basic skin tone was up next, and this one I used on an even smaller surface. I followed this up with pure ivory and finally some tiny amount of white on some select edges and on the rivets. Now the highlights were all in place, but the whole thing looked quite washed out and otherwise just similar to the bell. So I took some wine red, thinned it down to a very thin glaze consistency and started glazing it into the shadows and the midtones, making sure to not paint it over the highlights. Only tiny amounts are needed here, and it is better to build it up layer by layer because otherwise the whole thing can just turn red on you. When I was satisfied with the red tone, I used the same verdigris method from before around the rivets. And finally I added a small amount of OSL with the usual colors around the bottom edges of the sign. I thought that considering how shiny it is, it could catch some of the light even that high up.
Before I wrap things up, I had one more trick up my sleeve to improve the contrast and the vibrancy of the model. It was time to bust out some inks.
First I painted some transparent sepia ink on the horns and on the wood, mostly inside the shadows. So around the tip and the underside of the horns, for example. This boosts the color and deepens the shadows. Then I glazed some fluorescent green ink over all the things I painted in the Green OSL, once again boosting the vibrancy. And finally I used some night purple ink on the cloak for the same reason, glazing it into the shadows and some of the midtones carefully, because this thing is very pigment rich and can completely change how the cloak looks, which I didn't want. And there you have it, the Green Grey Seer is done and the end result looks like this. I think it turned out great, and I can see myself using a simplified version of this scheme on the rest of my Skaven models in the box as well. But what do you think? Have I succeeded with my little green scheme? Let me know in the comments.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe as usual. But if you would like to have easy access to written notes about all I did here, check out the PDF guides in the members only section here on YouTube or over at Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, and see you guys in the next one.